We will be doing agriculture in early and medieval Ireland. I'm Daire O Lochlainn. I'm from Kingdom of Avical, and we will wander through this. We're going to start a way back, so early Ireland, i.e., just immediate post-Ice Age, but we will move quickly through the Neolithic, Bronze Age, into the Iron Age and find the monastic era, and a little dabbling of the Hiberno-Norse at the very end. Anglo-Norman is just there as a placeholder. We don't actually go into any Anglo-Norman. To me, that's no longer Ireland proper. That is now the beginnings of the UK. So, Mesolithic Ireland. Ireland was at maximum glaciation, completely covered around 24 to 22,000 years ago. And that's what it looked like. So part of England itself wasn't covered, but the entirety of Ireland was. And this is kind of a false image. So I've got my little question marks here to remind me of that. What we're seeing is the present day coastlines of mainland Europe, England, Scotland, Ireland. And where I've got the question marks right there, at this time you could walk from London to Paris. Sea levels were 120 meters, 400 feet lower than they are now. So that was a land bridge. It's called Doggerland. So a bit of a misrepresentation of the mapping, but we see where the ice is. Ireland was basically clear by about 12,100 to 11,300. And that's kind of the signal for the beginning of the Mesolithic. Once people could get back onto the landmass, we have a Middle Stone Age occurring. But the ice didn't just drift slowly back in a nice organized fashion. There was lots of retreat, advance, retreat, advance. And it was particularly a lobe encroachment. And what we mean by that is this sort of red check mark I've got here. There was a lot of surging back and forth of the ice into this catchment area. And if you follow up, see my mouse, track my mouse, go up into Scotland, the Orkneys, Shetlands, that strip of land is the cold spot, for lack of a better term, that the ice was surging back and forth on. And you can see in Scotland here, all the glens running basically the direction that this ice was scouring back and forth. So it definitely had a huge impact on the present day geography. Yeah, the exclamation marks aid memoir to myself to tell you about this land strip that the ice was coming back and forth on. We did eventually get the end of the lobe breaking off, so that red dot is where a mass of ice sat while the rest of the lobe finally retreated completely. If anyone's been to Ireland, you'll know that there's a nice coastal periphery that's quite well developed, and then in the middle there's this wet bog. And this is why this block of ice essentially left us with that center part of Ireland somewhat uninhabitable during the Neolithic times. So all these sites on the periphery here emphasize just how boggy it was in the middle. And relevant to us would be the blue circles, the black squares, are probably and maybe the gray squares. Those are probably the most important to look at for what we're going to be talking about today. So the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic, we sort of go from this no agriculture to suddenly agriculture. And it's not like somebody went down to the corner store, picked up a magazine on farming and started doing it. The problem is, as the glaciers retreated and the water levels rose, people on the coast were being forced further and further inland. They were actually staying on the coast, but it would have been inland previously. So a lot of what would have been happening at that transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic is simply underwater. That underwater archaeology hasn't been done. Excuse me. But we're pretty sure that's where this transitional agricultural development was happening. Late Mesolithic, we did actually get one uh, one chunk of cattle in Ferreters Cove, County Kerry, down the far southwest. And one argument is that it might be evidence of a failed early colonization attempt. It could well just be somebody um, had a cattle carcass with them when they were traveling, and it was left behind. So it could have been literally a one-off slab of beef for a barbecue, because the evidence of cattle disappears from the record for quite a while after this. So into the Neolithic, we now have an agricultural revolution. Neolithic is going to be broken into a bunch of little chunks here. Blasting through those because they're going to be the titles of each of the following pages. So pre-3950 BCE, so 6,000 years ago, we have almost no cereal grain pollen evidenced. Around 3800, we suddenly have this surge of grain pollens. Some people say that as the agriculture was developing, fields were being cleared, the forests were being decimated, and that's why we had the elm decline. But the elm decline was actually it started, best part of 800 years before the real agricultural development. And my headspace says it's more to do with a larger climactic change than it was to do with human intervention at this point. No, I've already said that. Does not seem to be linked to land clearance. Early Neolithic, phase 2. This is the point where we start to see rectangular permanent buildings. And by permanent, I'm talking definitive post hole type buildings. So pit and post hole structure, things that we can find quite easily in the archaeology modernly. The earliest ones on record where there are some post hole evidence are these almost teepee-like reed structures. But they tend to be late Mesolithic into early Neolithic, and it's this that we're starting to see connected to the agrarian population. So this is your 6,000, 5,500-year-old farmhouse. This occurred countrywide. If you remember my map, you can see it's all around the periphery, looking primarily at the black squares and some of the gray squares. You can see that it's fairly widespread throughout the country. Once we've got into that period when we're seeing some of this cereal pollen in the archaeological record, it's a mixture of wheat and barley, predominantly wheat at this point. That's what the little plus sign is to make me remember that. Of the sites that we see here, 86% of the sites have wheat and barley, but it's a mixed crop assemblage. You had wheat and barley in the same field. You may have had more wheat than barley, but there wasn't barley field here, wheat field there. They were actually mixed in together. Hazelnuts found at 93% of sites, wild greens at 50% of sites. And this is where I usually get my first question. What do you mean by wild greens? So I did make a point earlier today of going through and trying to gather up a list from some of the older, older literature. to see what I could find. So at the end of this section, I'll have a page on the wild greens for the foresters and the hunter-gatherers and the herbalists. Apples and brambles at about 19% of the sites, and flax at 4% of the sites. Some of the argument is that we are looking at predominantly imported wool or linen, not linen, sorry, nettle for clothing, as opposed to flax/linen for clothing. Moving forward, we're still in a predominantly wheat environment at 92% of sites, but at this point, we now do have wheat field over here, barley field over there. They have separated them out. Hazelnuts again in that 90% range. Wild greens have dropped off by about 40%, so from 50 down to 30. Apples and brambles, again, they're probably cut in half from what they were previously. Flax is now absent, which again makes me think imported wool or nettle. And this may be the beginning of a monoculture dependency, which may explain some issues that occur a little bit later on. Middle Neolithic. At this point, we've suddenly bumped over to an increase of barley over wheat. Excuse me, I've had a cold for a few days. I'm going to be very rude here for a moment. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, wheat and barley at about 36% of the sites. That is down by 2/3. It just suddenly has dropped away. Hazelnuts have started to drop away. We're down about 15% from 90-ish to mid-70s. Wild greens have come back up to what they were previously, that 50% range. Apples, brambles have not only recovered, but they're now exceeding what was previously consumed. Right at the very beginning, I think we were at 19%, and then we jumped to 10, and now we're up to 30. Flax remains absent. So the question is, has there been sort of some crop collapse at this point? There seems to be more dependency on foraging and less dependency on the wheat and barley growing. And at this point, our previous elm decline has actually reversed. So again, I'm thinking there is some form of larger climatological change, which is affecting the crops. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I bump into barley a little bit later. Wheat and barley remaining in that mid 30% range. Again, predominantly barley now. Hazelnuts have stabilized, but they're still lower than they were. Wild greens are doing okay. Brambles doing okay, flax absent. With that going on, my question becomes, what is the caloric replacement? When we've lost our daily bread, what is the caloric replacement? And my argument is this might be the rise of the cattle culture and the domestic say the words, man. The domestication of cattle may be starting at this point. This sort of tidies up all those slides we've just gone through. And if we look, the dark line at the top, we've got that high, almost 90% cereal staying with us and then suddenly crashing. We've got the hazelnut in particular, very strong in the first two sections here, dropping off in the third section. Fruit dropping away and then returning, and then the wild greens recovering again. So this sort of consolidates a bit of what we were looking at previously. Wild greens, here we are. Wild garlic and watercress. They're common enough that they're almost what I would call an economy crop. There's talk about almost a garlic ritual. There's a garlic milk and cheese um, meal that you must offer your social superiors at a given time. And the watercress is basically treated as what we would consider a salad. Um, so it's not just thrown in and mixed in with everything else. It's almost a standalone um, uh, greens on the side. Looking at the Latin name for the garlic, I love that wild garlic, Allium ursinum. Um, it's bear garlic. Yeah, bears are wild. And if we look at the watercress, I was quite intrigued to see that it's basically a water nasturtium. Um, my wife loves her gardening, so nasturtium is a word I've heard thrown around, and watercress is a water nasturtium. Who knew? Brookline, it's one of the Veronicas. Again, similar environment, you might find the watercress. Um, the Latin name Becabunga, it's just so much fun to say. It means something like mouth smart, and smart as in, oh, that smarts, ouch, that stings. So the suggestion here from this name is that it's quite a bitter flavor. Nettle, tons of references to nettle, so much so that I'm struggling to isolate which particular genus and species. Wood sorrel, acetosola. Acetosola is vinegar-like. So again, something that's got quite a bitter flavor to it. Pignut. Um, is it's a tuber, and humans can dig it up and have a little chow down on that. And it's called pignut because it's one of the things that the boars and the pigs really got in and dug around for. Despite being called a nut, it's not particularly hard. It would be uh, more carrot-like as far as density goes. Um, Vetch or heath peas. Um, if we could think back to the map that I showed you with all the archaeological sites on the periphery of the map, um, most of that area is still below 250 meters. But when you break 250 meters in Ireland, they consider you to be in the mountains. So the Montanus of the name here suggests that we're at least 200, if not 250 meters up the side of the hill before we're starting to see the vetch and the heath. And seaweed, as it was with nettle, lots and lots of references to it. I sort of have my head halfway around maybe three or four of them. But yeah, it's seaweeds, lots of. So we're going to jump into the Bronze Age now. And this is where we do start to get the major land clearances. So around the middle of the Irish Bronze Age, we do get a definite decrease in the elm, the hazel, the ash, and the oak as far as the pollens. And initially a massive increase um, in the charcoal residue of these, and then it starts to decline. Um, we, I said we might be moving to a cattle type um, uh, caloric up. There's evidence, a lot of evidence that for wild animals, boar was particularly sought. Fox and bird, lots of different birds, were medium usage, and the deer were basically very limited. There seems to be less butchery of the deer than there is salvage and collect um, of the antlers. For the domesticated animals, it's predominantly cattle at this point. There is some pig. This pig will have come in from the continent. It will have made its way from probably Southeast Asia into continental Europe, and then across to Britain, and across then finally to Ireland. And sheep and goat are really difficult to differentiate in the bone mass when you're doing archaeology. My first degree was forensic archaeology, and I started as an animal bone guy and became a human bone guy. And better people, better, more learned people than I still struggle to get sheep and goat sorted out from the bone piles. There is evidence of horse and dog, some butchery. The argument here is that it's less about treating them as true domesticated animals for food. Um, it's more, the horse breaks its leg, you have to put it down. You're not going to turn down 300 or 400 pounds of meat. Um, so it's in the records, but it's not purpose bred, purpose raised for food. And I'm not going to talk about the dog. Dog's our best friend. Which brings me to mode of capture. One of my other presentations is on archery in Ireland, and archery in Ireland until until the Normans is just a tiny, tiny fragment of the archaeology. We're talking about uh, dozens of arrowheads found, or metal arrowheads found prior to mass production in places like Dublin with the Hiberno-Norse period. But really, bow and arrow was not used much for hunting, and certainly not used much for battle. Um, the fox and bird seems to be more slings, slings and stones, and the boar is predominantly capture hunted by spear. Um, and if you look at the archaeological record of burials, there's almost no ritual interment of swords early on. It's almost always spearheads that are found. When we start getting more and more cattle, again, we don't really have a history of Irish swords in this early period, but we are starting to see what becomes kind of the Irish fighting knife. Um, and in my head, that is because if the cattle are standing there in the yard, you don't need to throw a spear at them. You just walk over, cut the throat, and let them bleed out. So the archaeological record is showing what we consider to be weapons. I think it's reflecting more what's used in the capture of the primary protein sources. So, little detour. Let's come back. We get at this point the return of the roundhouse. When we think of Iron Age Britain in particular, it's this style of roundhouse always jumps into mind. But can we remember the little grass hut, the little grass teepee at the side of the pond earlier on? Completely different beast here. Here we have serious big post hole digging. We've got the wattle and daub walls. Um, when you excavate these, you also get the drip line where all the water's coming off of the top of the roofs here. You get this drip line, a nice big circle punched into the ground around the building. So these are big definitive structures, and we tend to think that everybody moved from round houses to square houses, but in Ireland there seems to be this odd move to the rectangular house before coming back to the round house, and it's not really until we get places like Dublin really being laid out, some of the first sort of urban planning, that we see consistent rectangular structures. Slightly prior to the the Viking visitations, we do see some of the monastic communities starting to go rectangular. But I don't really consider that to be a domestic. I think that's more of a continental or British import coming in with those religious orders. Bronze Age, we get the rise of the grain kiln. Um, so we've got predominantly our barley, and it needs to be dried. It needs to be dried for storage. There's two models essentially. One is sort of a clay oven type structure, which we see here, and the other is this going almost back to that late Mesolithic reed teepee. Uh, so with the reed teepee on the lower right, where my little mouse is dancing, that's the fire hole. This is the primary breathing hole at the front where the arch is. And of course, you get a bit of dissipation of the smoke up through the reed. But this is evidence of development of prolonged storage. So the seasonality of food source is starting to stabilize a bit at this point. Lots of barley. Hordeum species, particularly vulgare, starting to see more and more nudum at this point. I'll explain a little bit about this in a minute. It suggests we have a dry spell. The way that barley is laid out, there's a lot of structure here that can capture moisture. Whether it's rainfall or the morning dew or fogs rolling in from the coast. You need a reasonable amount of sunshine and a relatively low, for Irish standards, level of precipitation for this stuff to not rot before you can harvest it. Reading up again today on some of the barley in the 1950s to 1980s, maybe, there was a big move to split up all of the genus and species into smaller and smaller little groups. And what they've begun to find more recently, now that we're getting better at doing the genetic analysis, is that most of these variations that they identified from the 50s to the 80s are really single gene hiccups. And there seems to be a tendency now to start clumping a lot of the barley back together again in fewer and fewer genus and species. The predominant two-row versus six-row differentiation, again, is I think only two gene loci that are disrupted to get the change from what you see on the left as your two-row and what you see on your right as your six-row. The nudum, if you look at the ones on the left, this two-row barley, you can actually see the meat of the barley between some of the husk here, and it's a little firmer. So it almost cracks as opposed to squishes when you start to process it. But it's much easier to process than the six grain on the other side, which has a lot more fibrous, non-digestible matter, for lack of a better way to describe it, around the actual kernels. My brain has lost the thought it was about to say. Well, it's got the thought, it doesn't have the detail on it. I believe the Europeans at this time were almost exclusively using six grain for brewing, and the Irish were almost exclusively using the two row. For their brewing. If I've got that reversed, my apologies, but there does seem to be a distinct difference between continental Europe and Ireland as to who's using what for their brewing. I'm sure there's brewers amongst you who know more than I and can bring us up to speed on that at the end. So we talked about the 2 row, 6 row. We've talked about the change of species identification. Let's identify again. Lots of barley, which means limited wheat. We're again in this separate fields. We don't have mixed fields. Hazelnut and wild greens are starting to come back in. Oats and rye are starting to show up, but they tend to, it looks more like we've got wild inclusions. They're not planting an oat field. They're not planting a rye field. These are scattered grasses within the larger field. They're non-intentional, I guess, is another way of saying it. Sloe, elder, blackberry are starting to become more prevalent. Bramble is still kicking along here. So while we are farming, there's still quite a lot of gathering going on. And I did mention earlier the seasonality. Because we've got the grain kilns for drying, the seasonality of the staple of the diet, the breads and the beers, has become, it fluctuates much less now. So we're starting to get a good stabilization of the diet. The Bronze Age to Iron Age transition, archaeologically, is an absolute mess. Um, you don't go from, oh, look, I've got a bronze thing, and then 10 minutes later, oh, look, I've got an iron thing. We're starting to see iron tools, but a lot of the decoration, in particular, sheath is probably a better term than scabbard. Scabbard is probably a too glorious a term. Knife sheaths is probably um, a better argument there. And decorative items are still being done in bronze. But if we look at the very limited archery that's going on, we're still back in the Neolithic using flint arrowheads. So a lot of our mental time frames, Iron Age, Bronze Age, Neolithic Age, are are getting muddled up here. And you could have an iron tool, a bronze belt end, and a flint arrowhead on the same person on the same day. So it can be a bit of a mess to disentangle. So uh, we're still not 100% agricultural. There seems to be a drop off in some of the agrarian practices. Um, Evidence of this, tree species are in recovery, and this might be where we finally get to the big push for almost a full-scale cattle economy. We move away from um, scattered scattered farmsteads tied to the field and the drying kilns, and we start to get these multi-generational defensible raths. In my head, when I look at the images, it says we're willing to sacrifice our arable land in order to save the pastoral. So you can burn my barley field, just don't kill my cow. And I can never find the reference for this watercolor. I think it's absolutely exquisite. But if we start in the top left, we have some small patchwork of fields. And when I talk about the wild greens, these cattle, these oxen don't turn a tight corner. So in this corner here, you can have an arc going into the corner. So think of a triangle with a curved bottom. And that is kind of going to be your garlic patch. Um, Over here in this corner, I've got my apple tree, my Malus sylvestris, my little wild crab apples. Um, and when we get down into here, my head can't decide, are we breaking up new earth to put in a new arable field, or are we planting something more robust? Won't be potatoes yet. We haven't got over to pick any up from the South Americans yet. But when I look at this, um, some bad guy comes over the hill with his buddies. waving their spears and their fighting knives. I'm going to grab all of my pigs, all of my sheep, all of my cattle, my oxen. I'm going to bring them in here. I'm going to close the gate. And like I said, if you want to burn my barley field, go ahead and do that. I'm not letting you near my cow. Um, and that's kind of where my headspace is at for this Iron Age period. Um, and when I'm asking these questions of myself, I sort of circle this person in the red down the bottom right-hand corner and say to myself, what would that guy do? And that sort of is the way I try and anchor myself back into the environment and see how this all works together. You can see by the size of these walls and ditches, this isn't something you throw together in a weekend and then abandon a month later. This is where this multi-generational um, usage comes in. This is used for 100 years. Temporary hill forts. It astonishes me the size of the hill forts and the limited archaeological data that comes out of them. They seem to be you're starting to get into the age of the kings in Ireland. And the kings seem to bounce from hill fort to hill fort, and everybody from the surrounding land comes into the hill fort. There's the paying of your annual dues to the royalty. Um, and then they move on. Everybody then abandons the hill fort, essentially goes back to their own wrath. Um, and it astonishes me, like I said, how big these hill forts are, and how little um, time they're actually in use. Increase in ritual locations. We're starting to see um, wooden walkways going into a bog area, and at the end of the walkway, we're finding bent knives, bent spearheads, things like that. The item is being intentionally damaged before it's being deposited. Part of this also is we start to see the bog bodies. Now, whether these are ritual sacrifice, whether they are um, uh, judicial executions. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. It's not my area. We get people like the Clonach uh, roughly 390 BCE to 200 BCE. So he's probably a bit earlier than the Iron Age we're sitting in now, but I think he was founded in 2003, and he's quite a good representation. And what I really like is if we look up here on the left side, it's almost like he has a bit of an Elvis hairdo here. And the sampling of the hair shows that this was intentional. There was a resin-based hair gel essentially holding the structure of the hair. This isn't just a casual, the peat pushed it this direction as it developed over the body. This looks like it was an intentional fashion statement. Jackson writes a book, The Oldest Irish Tradition. And on the one hand, he's talking about the tales of the age of the heroes. We're talking the cattle raids of Cooley. We're talking Finn McCool. We're talking, the real big um, stories about the Irish heroes. But if you read between the lines, the oldest Irish tradition also is just you get a couple of pints in these guys and they're going to start swinging fists. I was born in Northern Ireland, and I've yet to go to a wedding or a wake where a fight hasn't broken out. So yeah, there's the spicy characters. Palmer talks about a cattle raid going sideways, and you end up with a horse load of heads. And the suggestion here is there's so many heads that It requires a horse to drag them away. Um, so we're in a time of turmoil. Um, there's a lot of minor kings. It's not You don't have a king of all Ireland, or you very rarely have a king of all Ireland. Um, so we tend to think of king being a nation, head of a nation. Um, Kings in the Irish sense at this point are more head of the clan, excuse me, or head of a number of clans. And with a number of with this high number of kings, there's conflict between them. We move into the monastic period. We're now moving from prehistoric to historic. Prior to this, everything has been oral tradition. It's not until we um, get the religious orders coming into Ireland that we start getting things written down. And Ireland is very unique in that we, we never had a Roman domination in Ireland. Um, Got into England, Wales, right down to the bottom of Dorset and Cornwall. Uh, got a good way up the north of England, bumped into the Picts and some other, um, shall we say, salty individuals up there. So they uh, didn't quite get all of mainland Britain, but they didn't get into Ireland pretty much at all. So there's no classical Latin based history for Ireland. There's occasional mentions of Hibernia, but there's nothing being generated within the country on paper, well, on vellum, until the monastic period. And because there wasn't that big um, Roman/Latin domination, a lot of the oral tradition was actually um, put down scribally in the vernacular. Ireland has probably the largest early vernacular library um, anywhere. It's pretty cool. We definitely have an increase in arable farming at this point. Continental influence. Cattle value, as in using cattle as a type of coinage. Um, the religious orders try and quash that because the cattle it's the wealth to a large extent of the minor kings. If you can um, if you can devalue their currency, so to speak, you devalue their power, and that's a bit of what's going on here. There's still lots of cattle, but they start to lose that cash value that they previously had. Um, Many of the farmers are actually lay brothers. They never go into the order. They never take their vows. Um, the gardener is generally a brother and not one of the lay brothers, and is an identifiable functionary within the monastery community. Similarly, the miller is a functional or a functionary. He is a named person within the order. Um, and the monasteries often, they said politely, sponsored the local mills. But if you wanted to use it, they took a big tithe. So as generous as they were by making the mill that you could use rather than having to use your hand quern, it was expensive. Monasteries tended to inherit or be bequeathed farmed areas rather than developing their own. And the drying kilns tended to be out in the sticks where the farming itself was occurring. So the grain would have been dried and then brought into the mill. Um, you didn't have the clerics dirtying their hands with the drying kiln. Um, the monastery gets the white bread and the ale, the wheat and the barley. The laity gets the coarse and the flat bread, um, oats, rye, peas, beans. Oats now actually becoming a crop, rye now becoming a crop, peas and beans becoming crops rather than forage. At this point, um, when we look at a rath, the out farms, the carcasses of the pigs and cattle are young. When we go into the monastic location and we do the archaeology, the carcasses tend to be older. So the argument here is that the farming is done at a distance. Um, if there is a young accidental death um, of livestock, it's butchered and et on the site. The the animals that have been matured to a point where they're good eating and lots of calorie, at that point they are driven um, uh, to the monastery site where they're slaughtered and devoured. Jump ahead to the Hiberno-Norse period. The Norse and the Danes, when they arrived in Ireland, they were looking for the hayrick. They were looking for where you stored your winter fodder. They didn't realize quite how temperate Ireland was, and the animals can graze and browse year round. You don't need to um, store any fodder for them. We start to lose the drying kilns in the archaeological record because the Norse method of cropping, rather than just cutting the heads, the grain heads, they cut low to the ground, and then they can do sheafs and ricks for stacking, and you get drying, sun and wind drying rather than taking it to a kiln. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork become market towns which grow into large export centers. So we've changed from an insular mentality. Things are now almost becoming a North Atlantic um, circle of trade. From Greenland to was it Strava Lagoda at the far end of uh, the eastern end of Europe, getting into what's the Rus territories. Um, we're starting to see an increasing age in the livestock in these market towns. Again, they're being fattened up at a distance and then driven into town. Cattle are definitely on the upswing again. The pig is dropping away. Um, the major families of medieval Ireland ruled the best land, and we've seen that with that circle of archaeology around the periphery of the island. Um, and Yet they still demanded tribute from the poorer neighbors. The poorer neighbors were pushed off the good land and were starting to get above this 250-meter sea level, this 800, 900-foot sea level. Uh, what in my mind is sort of you're getting above the tree line, but I look out my window here, our tree line is like 2,200 meters. Um, so it's not a true tree line, but that's kind of where my head goes with it. The cattle economy, it starts to return. Cattle become coin again. Ireland is quite unique in that a lot of their annals and manuscripts are written um, on calf vellum as opposed to sheep vellum. Um, so there's, you know, the decreasing cattle in the monastic period that is suggested, as I said earlier, I don't think it's a decrease in number. I think it's during the monastic period a decrease in the valuation, which is returned to the economy when the Norse move in. So I think I got in under the hour. Thank you for listening. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your patience and your attentiveness. As I said, it's been a pleasure, quite flattering to have people come.